Can everybody hear? Right? So the talk, as you know, is called Rethinking Nuclear Weapons. And I'm going to talk about this at the end, but I'm just going to start with a little bit of setting it in context. I mean, it's very important that we're now rethinking nuclear weapons because just at the beginning of this year, the members of the board of the atomic scientists decided that there is a doomsday clock, which people might be aware of. It's a sort of clock that they have, and they have put the hands however close to midnight, midnight being, you know, the end, that they feel that the world is with respect to very serious issues, mainly nuclear weapons, but also climate change. So at the beginning of this year, they moved the doomsday clock 2 minutes closer to midnight. So from 5 minutes to 3 minutes to midnight. So this seems to be a good time for us to start really thinking, what are some of the issues involved with nuclear weapons? And as you know, I just put that up on the board, that nuclear weapons have the potential to destroy civilization and the entire ecosystem. So that's why it's really important that we're going to give some consideration to these type of weapons. Whoops. Now, nuclear weapons, if they're so bad, that's the question everyone asks. If they're so bad, why do we still have them? I mean, if there's something that could destroy the whole ecosystem, why could we not just get rid of them? And that is the conundrum that's been facing people for about the past 70 years. And so this talk, as I say, is going to see if we can kind of rethink some of our basic assumptions about nuclear weapons and see if thinking about them slightly differently can give us some insights of how we might pursue getting rid of them. I mean, we have certain default positions that we've had, and we need to examine those to see, are those still the right positions to have? So a lot of what I'm going to say is based on the arguments that Ward Wilson very decently put into this book, 5 Myths on Nuclear Weapons. And the great thing about this book is it's clearly written and very short. And so if you want to find out quite a bit about nuclear weapons in a nice, easy, accessible way, that's the book for you. And there's lots of copies in the Toronto Public Library, should anyone feel so inclined. So that's the book that I'm going to be basing a lot of these discussions on. And here we are. He has these 5 myths. And the first myth is that nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapon that will end all wars. So more or less, they're something that we have to have. Okay. And as you know, nuclear weapons have only been used twice. They were used in the Second World War. This is complicated. It's a bit hard to see, and I didn't write it all down, expecting I would be able to see it on the side. Okay, so I will stand here. Can you still hear? So nuclear weapons have only been used twice in the Second World War. And that war, as you know, was fought on 2 fronts. And by August, when the nuclear weapons were dropped, the war in Europe was over, but the war in Japan was continuing. Now, Japan, as you know, had entered the war to acquire more territory. And they had had considerable success. The Japanese had been very successful, and they were formidable enemies. So the Allies had done everything they could during the time they were fighting the war in Japan. So there'd been embargoes, they'd cut off food supplies, oil supplies, they'd done practically everything you could do militarily. And still the Japanese had not surrendered. So by this time, the Japanese had not surrendered. So having put every military effort into it, the Americans dropped the bomb, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. And most people think, and this is very sort of key, most people think, and so I've called it the traditional account, most people think that the dropping of the atom bomb was the one thing that ended the war in Japan. Okay, so we've got a timeline here. August 6th, the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. The 15th, the Japanese surrendered. Oops. So that's how most people think of the role of the atom bomb in this ending the Second World War. There is, okay, which I call the second ideas that people have about the ending of the war in Japan. It's called the revisionist account, and for our purposes, I'm not going to talk too much about that. It's that many people feel that there was really no need to drop the atom bomb, that Japan was going to surrender anyway. I personally, having kind of looked at it, it seems to me that Japan was able to fight for the next few months, and even though they were, you know, being defeated, there was still an opportunity for them to have one more battle, and that would have lost, we don't know how many American lives, not 300,000, but certainly some. And so that, that is why the bomb was used. But we will now go to what we will call the third theory of what ended the war in Japan. And that theory's been put forward by other people, but it really got a lot of publicity when Tsuyoshi Hasegawa in 2005 put out this book called Racing the Enemy, which was terrifically well reviewed by people who won Pulitzer Prizes in nuclear weapons and Japanese studies and so forth. So it's kind of a dense book to read, and that's why I'm grateful to Ward Wilson for kind of condensing some of the arguments. But anyway, Professor Hasegawa is a Japanese American who actually speaks Russian. And so when he was looking at all the documents, he was able to read the Japanese documents, the Russian documents, and of course the English documents. And he came up with his own story, his own theory, which was again, at the beginning of August, Japan was really in a state of collapse, but it was resisting unconditional surrender. And now we have another video. Should sound be coming.
58% of Yokohama. Yokohama is roughly the size of Cleveland.
Magic.
58% of Cleveland destroyed. Tokyo is roughly the size of New York.
This is showing the bombings in Japan prior.
99% of the equivalent of Chattanooga, which was Toyama. 40% of the equivalent of Los Angeles, which was Nagoya. This was all done before the dropping of the nuclear bomb.
So this is taken from The Fog of War. That's Robert McNamara's voice. And he's saying that prior to the dropping of the atom bomb, there had been 66 cities in Japan that had been systematically bombed, and some of them bombed to 99% destruction, some bombed to around 50% destruction. But in his view, the Japanese were kind of accepting that bombings were happening. So when on August the 6th, the bomb was dropped, that was one action that happened. But on August the 8th, which is fairly close, something else happened. And that was that the Russians decided to enter the war. And how the Russians indicated that they were entering the war is what they invaded Manchuria, which was a Japanese possession, and were getting in a position to come to invade the islands. But anyway, their invading of Manchuria signaled that they were participating in the war. Now, for the Japanese, this was terrifically significant because they had hoped that Russia would stay out of the war, as actually they had promised to do, but anyway, they'd hoped they would stay out of the war and kind of help them mediate with the United States to get, they knew they were losing the war, but they wanted better terms of peace when defeat actually came. They had planned to have this one last-ditch battle in the south of Japan, and they'd moved all their forces to there. And then they knew as soon as the Russians came to the north that they couldn't fight on two fronts. It was game over there, and it was game over in terms of getting the Russians to be helpful to them negotiating with the States. So, in his view, this is the timeline. And I think it's very interesting to put things up like this because then it's sort of much easier to see how things were. So in August, Hiroshima was bombed. And what Hasegawa said was the crucial thing that would have to happen for surrender to take place is the Supreme Council would have to be called. There were a group of 6 people, 6 senior people who were running the war effort. So Hiroshima was bombed. There was no attempt to call the Supreme Council. On the 7th, there was no attempt. Now, people noticed that the bombing had happened, and one of the officials said it made him feel more gloomy, and other people said, what will it do to the war effort? People will not want to, save food for the troops. But they did not speak of surrender. Then it was 1 minute to midnight on the 8th when the Soviets declared war on Japan and began their invasion. And almost immediately after, the Supreme Council was called to discuss surrender, and subsequently there was a surrender. So I can only really allude to it here, so you have to read some of the documents and so forth. But he does make a very plausible case for that. And one of the complications, of course, is on the 15th when the emperor announces his surrender. He says that he is surrendering because of the atom bomb. That is what he told the Japanese people. He told the army earlier on he was surrendering because of the Russian invasion. And with Hasegawa looking at some of the comments that had been made, things like the emperor saying the bomb was God-given, I think was the phrase he used, because it enabled the emperor and the military leaders to say they were defeated because of this amazing scientific phenomena, and not to have to take the blame for losing the war. So it fitted in very well, but it certainly confuses people, because why the emperor says that he surrendered is perhaps not the whole story. So that's another way of looking at it, and I think it's really significant because you can really see that the atom bomb was not the crucial part of the deliberations. Okay. Oh, I've already said that. Okay. Come. Okay. So the big question is, does it really matter why the Japanese surrendered? And it seems to me it does, because if people think that these weapons are the ultimate answer, they're reluctant to give them up no matter what the risk. And certainly that seems to be true when you talk to people. It really is people's default belief that the atom bomb is the one weapon that worked when it was tried. And that, even people who believe that one day we should have nuclear disarmament are kind of reluctant to really give up the idea of not having this most powerful weapon. So that's myth number 1. And we can carry on and talk about it later, I think, just to keep the flow going. So this is myth number 2. And this is that nuclear weapons are so destructive, which is true, but that destruction wins wars. And that is a belief that people have had forever, that the most powerful weapon is always the weapon that wins. It's gone from the beginning of time as weapons got more and more powerful. So you can see that a 1.5 kiloton bomb will cause so much destruction. A much larger bomb causes infinitely more. Come. Well, we'll hear the overture and then I thought it would go on when I pressed it. We're going to have to let the whole slide go on that one. But what that slide was a whole dramatic sort of portrayal of Napoleon's army entering Russia. And 690,000 troops and massive destruction, and it was expected that that would absolutely take the day. And of course it didn't, because the people of Moscow had left and so forth. So it still is the thing that kind of clings to us. People like this idea of, you know, strength and military might, and that is going to win. I mean, we see it forever. We saw it with Bush, you know, saying mission accomplished. We see it all the time. This is a sort of theory that people really like. And that is a myth that Ward Wilson and others think that we need to kind of forget about, because massive destruction isn't necessarily the way to do things. You have to destroy the enemy's military. And the reason that we put this up is it's awfully hard to figure out what people mean sometimes when they say they win the war is won. This was actually a quote from a general at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I suppose he actually believed it. But he said at the end of the war, if there's 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we have won. That's when they were discussing, you know, if we have a nuclear confrontation in the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, there'll be 90 million dead here and 120 million dead there, but the 90 million will be Americans, and so we'll have won. So, destruction does not win wars. Another indication that that is true was when they did a survey of this Allied strategic bombing. The strategic bombing helped, but it was not decisive. So it's hard lessons that people are learning through this, and we're not actually learning. I mean, think of the end of the Iraq War. I mean, people still think that destruction, massive destruction, is going to win wars, but not necessarily. Killing civilians doesn't win wars. To win a war, you have to destroy the enemy's military. So that's myth 2. And then we come to myth 3. I can't speak because I keep running out of water. So we come to myth 3, which is really probably the most significant in many ways, which is that nuclear deterrence works in a crisis. And really that is the main reason we still have nuclear weapons. Even people, as I've said, who want nuclear disarmament, they want nuclear disarmament sometime in the future when everybody has gone down absolutely equally. And when you press people on that, you usually get that they somehow think that it would be so terrible if one side had a slight advantage, they might be able to do all sorts of terrible things to the other side, which still means that they are believing in deterrence, I think. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you had lecture on 2 weeks ago, very good lecture, was the closest we ever came to nuclear war. And it is always given as such a good example of deterrence. But you have to think about it. I mean, if nuclear deterrence really worked, Kennedy and Khrushchev would not have allowed the situation to escalate as it did. If they really believed that it would be unthinkable to go to war against another power that had nuclear weapons, they would have damped it down, surely. And in fact, Kennedy said so himself. He said, you know, if only he hadn't believed the CIA, who told them that there were no offensive weapons going to Cuba, he wouldn't have put such a hard line saying he would never allow it. So, but he did. They did allow this confrontation. And as McNamara said, it really wasn't deterrence that saved us. It was luck. And we came this close to nuclear war. And I think another reason, I'm just going to bring this up because I am interested in myths. That's sort of the thing that I am most fascinated in at the moment. At the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a negotiated settlement. There really was. Kennedy agreed not to invade. Khrushchev agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. And secretly, Kennedy agreed to remove his missiles from Turkey. But that was kept secret, so no one really knew there was a negotiation. And in fact, Kennedy lied and said there wasn't. There was an article in the Saturday Evening Post, December the 8th, which he kind of wrote, and he said he would never have negotiated with the Soviets. He said it would be a terrible thing to do. He blamed it all on Adlai Stevenson, who was a kind of left-wing person who was his Secretary of State. And actually, Kennedy said he would have never done such a Munich-like thing. And poor Adlai Stevenson, who had only put forward the same sort of negotiation that Kennedy had actually done, kept going to Kennedy and saying, you know, everyone's thinking I'm dreadful. Could you rehabilitate me? Could you say, you know, it wasn't just me? And then, as you know, Kennedy was shot, and that was never said. So Adlai Stevenson was left with that. 25 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Theodore Sorensen admitted that they had negotiated, but they were all so afraid that America would be seen as weak, that he, and he was PhD from Harvard and so forth, had excised those notes even from the record. So Kennedy falsified what he said in an article, and Theodore Sorensen actually took out the remarks that showed that there had been a negotiation. And only 6 people in the States actually knew about it. The Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, was never told. So that, again, perpetuates the idea that in a crunch, deterrence works. You know, strength and your nuclear arsenal, hang tough, and you'll win the day. And that is a problem. You know, that is a real problem. There's so many cases when deterrence hasn't really worked. You have to just think of it. In Korea, you know, North Korea knew that the Americans were there on behalf of South Korea. They knew that the Americans had nuclear weapons. Were they scared off? They were not. You know, they were not. Then we had Vietnam, the communist North versus the non-communist South. The US entered on the side of the South, and the North knew it, and they said basically the Vietnamese equivalent of bring it on. They were not deterred in the least. So one isn't always deterred by the fact that nuclear weapons are on the other side. The Falkland Islands is, I think, the most bizarre one of this because, you know, Argentina knew that Britain had nuclear weapons. And also there's some apocryphal story that Margaret Thatcher was trying to get the codes to the weapons and so forth, but it is apocryphal. But still in all, Argentina did not back down. And in the Middle East, Israeli forces were attacked by Syria and Egypt. Israel was known to have nuclear weapons. Syria and Egypt did not back down. And in the last case, we have the Gulf War. And the United States threatened the full measure of force, which is code for nuclear weapons, if chemical or biological weapons were used, oil wells were fired, or terrorist attacks were made. The last 2 both occurred. Threatened weapons were not used. So you have to keep saying, is deterrence really a success? Has it been successful? Has it deterred? Right. So that, after we'll have to have some discussion on this, because that really does seem to me, the belief in this is why we have still got, oops, back. Whoops. Okay. Sorry, I meant to set this up. This video, I'm going to get used to this when I do the last video of this presentation. I'm sure I'll do it perfectly, but be that as it may. This is showing various leaders speaking, attesting to their strong belief that it is nuclear weapons that keep us safe. So it's not only do they think that, but NATO, I mean, there's been so many statements coming out of NATO in the last year that nuclear weapons are the supreme protector of the peace, et cetera, that it is a fairly firm belief that we have. Now, we have to hope that when I do this, this will come on properly. No, back. Try going back one more. All right.
We need nuclear weapons.
There we go.
Because having them makes peace more secure.
Они открыто провозглашают планы к развязыванию ядерной войны. Эту борьбу мы не можем ослабить ни на один день. И будем вести ее до тех пор, пока опасность не будет отодвинута, пока не будет обеспечен прочный мир.
It is time for us to start a build-up, a rebuilding of the military might of America. And it is time for us to build that to the point that no other nation on this earth will ever dare raise a hand against us. And in this way, we will preserve world peace. And we're the only ones who can do it.
I saw someone saying, who's that? Ronald Reagan? Right. So I bring this up because this was an article in the 2009 Newsweek, but it's by Jonathan Tupperman. He's now the managing editor of Foreign Policy, and may I tell you, he's continuing to write the same sort of articles. He is a firm believer in the fact that nuclear weapons are just a great idea. It is nuclear weapons, and many people having them, that keeps us safe. And he's firmly he rests this on two beliefs, that people are rational, that all people are rational, and that no one would start a war if they knew they were going to be defeated. So that article you can get from Newsweek. He's very, very committed, but he's not the only one. He's very committed to that perspective. We've already seen that the idea that people are rational is not totally the thing that guides everybody's policies. But, and in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was, Fidel Castro had one day when he wrote to Khrushchev and said, I'll sacrifice the whole of Cuba, myself, and all my people, to defeat the Americans. So he was willing to have an atom bomb. He was willing to send an atom bomb to the States, knowing that one would return. So the idea that we can believe that people are always rational seems to me kind of impossible. But many, many people do believe it. And again, Newsweek at the time, 2009, still had a fairly large circulation. They also believe that there hasn't been a nuclear war, in the last 70 years. And that is because, so they jump to the conclusion that that is because we have nuclear weapons which are preventing a nuclear war. So that's what they think. And they say that it's such a long peace, and there's never been such a long peace. Well, there have been other periods when there have been, but they're really convinced of that. So there's other reasons why we haven't had war in the last 70 years. One is exhaustion. Two is that we now have closer economic ties. We're more global. Three is that there's more alliances that have been formed. I mean, there's many ways. There's international treaties and organizations. And sometimes we just have had periods of peace. The previous long period of peace was from 1815 to 1914. So I guess if you were talking in 1913, you might say peace will go on forever. And you might think of all the reasons why it would. They may not be the valid reasons, and 1914 might well show you that's not true. But that's an interesting quote from Kennedy. So then, we do come to myth number 5, which again is one that people find very hard to deal with, which is that there's absolutely no alternative. Nuclear weapons have been invented. They're invented. People say there's nothing you can do about it. So let's just continue having them because there's nothing else we can do. But as you know, technology doesn't get disinvented, it gets replaced. Okay? So there's examples there, and I'm about to show you another couple. So those are kind of fun. Those have been replaced by other more useful technologies. Right. So this is my most controversial point. People don't always like this, but I believe this is so. We've got nuclear weapons, and if we don't want to have them, if we want disarmament and not to use nuclear weapons, which is what I believe is the only sensible thing to do, we can't just say to NATO and everyone else, you can't have nuclear weapons. I think that one has to say, you can't do this. The better thing is to try that, whatever that is. And we don't know at the moment what that is. I know there's a lot of criticism of the States. They're now developing a conventional weapon that goes on a missile. It's called the Global Strike Missile, or whatever it's called. But I would like to see some group, maybe the Simons Foundation, somebody, help people think of what would you do if you weren't going to have nuclear weapons and the military was still going to be a part of your total equation. It's not going to be the whole part. There's many aspects to security, but the military is a part of it. So what do you want to do to respond to? Everyone is always afraid there might be some breakout nuclear threat. Someone might have secreted some extra weapons and we'd all start to have disarmament, and then these extra weapons would appear and we'd all be held hostage. We might have to live with that. I keep thinking we're smart enough to think of what would we do? You know, what sort of thing would we, how would we arrange it? I mean, if you think of, say, a municipal police force, any kind of security force has to have some aspect of force. Now, I personally don't agree the fact that every policeman needs to carry a gun. I don't like that. I like the system in England where the policemen do not carry guns, but there is a special task force of people who do have guns. It seems to work very well. Very few civilians are killed inadvertently by police in England and so forth. But they operate with some degree of force. And our Army, our Navy, whatever, is going to be charged with keeping us secure, in some way dealing with bullies or thugs or whatever. It may not be the only way, but if it may be. I think that we need to start thinking of what do we want to use instead. And people are really reluctant to think that because they think, I don't want to think of other weapons. Well, you're going to go from not using nuclear weapons as a threat to how would you counter a threat? I mean, people are now talking and chatting about what would you do if a nuclear bomb dropped on Warsaw? So you start to think, well, what would you do? Surely you'd do something more sensible than just send a nuclear bomb back on Moscow. There might be other things that you could do. When Syria had all their chemical weapons, people didn't immediately start thinking, well, how do we ramp up our chemical weapon delivery systems? You know, how can we get more chemical weapons? How can we go and drop some chemical weapons on Syria? They thought of some sensible things to do that actually kind of worked, or are in the throes of working. So I think, in a way, that is one of the things that we have to do for rethinking. When we're thinking, no, we don't want nuclear weapons, and we don't, we have to think of how would we structure a military that could deal with threats. And it may have to deal with a nuclear threat. I mean, it may be that if someone just decides they're going to drop a bomb, there's not a lot you can do about it. If they do, everyone says, Putin might just drop a bomb. Well, we hope he doesn't. But if he does, we would have to figure how to deal with it. So that's definitely one of the things to think about. I will just do one little small anecdote here. Last year I spent a lot of time with a group of people, some one generation younger than me, quite a lot 2 generations younger, and we were working out policies that we thought would be useful for one of the political parties. It turned out to be the Liberal Party, and it turned out the policies we thought might be useful were not accepted. But be that as it may, we all spent a lot of time, and the one I picked was to do a nuclear weapons-free Arctic. And got a lot of help, got quite a good policy, and really it just did not connect with anybody. I mean, for whatever reason. Because people kept saying to me the usual yes, but. Yes, but. One was it would take too long. People aren't going to agree. And then everyone said, but what if they agreed? And I guess it's because we're in the West. They said, what if Russia decided, you know, not to honor it? And you keep thinking, well, to make it something that people could think about more, that's again where I think you could perhaps take the Arctic and develop some policies on what would you do if us, Canada, decided that we never wanted to use nuclear weapons in our Arctic, but we couldn't convince the Russians to adopt that policy. We would hope the Russians wouldn't be stupid enough to use a nuclear weapon. But if they did, what would we do? And I think there we could start thinking of different scenarios which might be controversial, but it might at least get people interested in some sort of possibilities of things that might be done or not done. So I think that that's one of the ways we have to rethink things. Oops, back again. Okay, now we are now going to come to one of the other things that are the real difficulties of rethinking nuclear weapons. And I don't know the solution to this one, but maybe some people here do. That they are such a token of power, they have become such a token of power, that it's hard for me to see how that is going to change. This video is going to show how excited and pleased Pakistan was to get the nuclear weapon.
The first time we've achieved something which places us in the ranks of very, very few countries of the world. We were proud of our scientists, we were proud of our capabilities, we were proud of our strength. People thought that now let India do anything to Pakistan. Let's see what they do.
That, I think, is interesting because most of the reasons you hear from Britain, from France, wanting to keep their nuclear weapons, that is the currency of power. The P5, which are the nuclear weapons countries, the 5 main, that seems to be what people aspire to. And I have not been able to think of what could be a more appropriate currency of power. And I'm hoping that someone else can think of that, but I put that up as a real problem in the rethinking of nuclear weapons. They have become sort of de facto, you know, the winning ticket, so to speak. Okay. I forget how I set that up. The other thing is that they are really, and rightly so, people really are terrified of them. And as we're rethinking things, we might want to rethink the relative risks. I mean, we'll show you the Ahmadinejad clip, and you can see that he is really posing quite a question to everybody. If we can hear it. What's he done? I mean, I did. What? Okay. Why do you have the right to deprive us? If it's a good thing, then we should have them too. Why should only you have it? If it's bad, etc. So that is a real issue in the putting the genie back in the bottle. People are going to be able to avail themselves, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about it. Now, one of the great successes at the moment is that it does look like courageous Obama and John Kerry, etc., there seems to be some indication that the negotiations with Iran will work. It seems to me if that works and people feel more confident, Obama might be able to get back on track with his ideas of reducing nuclear weapons and so forth. People have been very hung up with this sort of panic. That's a very impressive thing. So it does seem that as we're rethinking all this, we're really quite capable of coming up with other ways of regarding the situation. They are a man-made problem, and therefore, surely we can solve the problem. There have been various efforts, but I think it is partly that we've kept falling back on sort of a panicked way of thinking. We really can't do anything about these weapons, and we're going to have to think more deeply on that. We know that it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm just going to show a few pictures now of people who are actually really working on it to show you that there are people who are trying to think this through. That's Ray Atchison, directing Critical Will, which is part of a peace group, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in New York. Susie Snyder, who works with Pax Christi, another anti-nuclear group, and Tim Wright, who is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And the last thing I'm just going to be bringing up here is when we're rethinking things, we have to keep in mind how expensive nuclear weapons are. And I've almost given up trying to explain to people that if we didn't spend money on nuclear weapons, we'd have money to spend on clean water and education and this and that, because basically people don't seem to be gravitating to that, although they should. So I'm thinking maybe we do sort of go back to the board of the atomic sciences and think, let's tie climate change in much more closely, because everyone is going to be affected by climate change. I have a feeling that people think clean water is going to be for other people and not so, well, maybe keen on that, but not desperately keen. But maybe everybody will be keen on climate change, because the reason that the doomsday clock, as I said at the beginning, has been set back is the problems with climate change and the stalling of nuclear disarmament. So if we could take some of this extended money that we're spending on nuclear weapons, and if we could, it's just saying what I've already said, but you can read it. If we could kind of reconfigure that to working on climate change, maybe we would find that it would be one of the things that we could do. We could redirect the money from the nuclear weapons program, because keeping the weapons means that we're putting everyone at such risks, and the security benefits may not be what they appear. I think we have to really press on that. And maybe we could start thinking of using that money to mitigate climate change. And there's my talk. Right.